Hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Christensen, and this is Horror 101 with Dr. AC, celebrating classic horror throughout history with new episodes every Friday night. 1975's Shivers, aka They Came From Within, is a milestone in Canadian horror cinema and horror cinema in general, in that it introduced writer-director David Cronenberg to moviegoers everywhere, and the world has never been the same since. As a high-rise residence is thrown into chaos when a strange parasite starts turning the tenants into sex-crazed versions of themselves, Shivers introduces many of the themes that Cronenberg would return to time and again over his half-century behind the camera. Disease, transformation, technology, sexuality, identity, science, ethics, isolation. Not bad for a low-budget exploitation film, which could also be described as sex slugs take over the world. Adding to the film's cult appeal, we have Ivan Reitman, pre-Stripes, Ghostbusters, and Kindergarten Cop serving as producer, with horror legends Barbara Steele and Lynn Lowry delivering a perfect pair of off-kilter performances, and a slew of gloriously gooey, lo-fi practical effects from makeup maestro Joe Blasco. Being partially government-funded, Shivers stirred up major controversy in Canada, but the moral outrage only increased its notoriety and box office returns. And 50 years later, the film has been reappraised as a smart, subversive mini-classic that deftly combines horror, humor, and social commentary. Let's head back to 1975 and celebrate David Cronenberg's Shivers.
If you think you're not afraid of the dark, if you think you have a strong stomach, if you feel nothing can shock you, if you say you don't scare easily, if you believe you've seen everything, then prepare yourself for a motion picture that takes you beyond fear, beyond your wildest nightmares, and brings you face to face with terror, beyond the power of priest or science to exorcise. What are they? Raging demons from another world? Bloodthirsty creatures that must be killed? Or incarnations of absolute evil? They possess men, women, and children, and drive them to acts of unbelievable horror. No one is safe from them. No power on earth can stop them. The only escape is death. If this picture doesn't make you scream and squirm, you'd better see a psychiatrist. Quick.
Sail through life in quiet and comfort. Cruise Starliner. We're here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of David Cronenberg's Shivers, and we have an incredible panel to chat about it with me. Let's bring everybody in, and let's say hello to Cullen Wade.
Good morning.
Kate Hansen.
Hi.
Emily Barney.
Hey, hey.
John McDevitt.
Hey everybody, so glad to be here.
And Jason Kaufman.
Oh, thanks for having me again, and my cats.
And we're going to be chatting about Shivers from 1975, celebrating its 50th anniversary, aka They Came From Within, among a couple other titles that we'll talk about during the course of the show. And we will be chatting spoilers, so if you haven't seen the movie, please check it out and then come back and join our conversation already in process. Process or progress? I'm not sure which. Thanks for coming on the show, everybody, and welcome. Cullen, I know you've written a book about horror featuring swimming pools, and a swimming pool does in fact feature prominently in this movie. Tell us a little bit about your book and how you came to the movie for the first time.
I was thinking about it this morning because I knew that question was coming. How did I come to the film? It's possible that Shivers might be to credit for me becoming enamored with swimming pool scenes in horror films. Obviously, there was the Are You Afraid of the Dark episode, also Canadian, by the way, the Tale the Dead Man's Float, when I was like a little kid. But this one was pretty early on. It was probably one of the first horror films I saw where I thought about the pool kind of like conceptually, you know. Early 20s, I think I discovered this. I had seen The Fly and Dead Zone prior. But then it was actually History of Violence that made me a Cronenberg believer. And after that came out, I saw that blew my mind. Then I researched the whole back catalog. And Shivers was the one that really hit me on first watch. I think there were things like, I think Rabid took me a while to kind of acclimate to. And there were some others like The Brood, but Shivers just hit me right away. And I've also always loved films set in apartment buildings, so it kind of checked a lot of boxes for me. So yeah, the book is coming out. It's called Splasher Flicks, the swimming pool in horror cinema. It's coming out sometime this year from McFarland Books. I assume it'll be out in the summer, but I haven't gotten galley proofs yet. So I run through basically 3 sort of critical lenses to think about the swimming pool in horror films. There's 100 films that I write about. Shivers is kind of an anchor for the middle section, which is about the pool as a site of sexuality. Surprise, surprise.
It certainly is here.
Yeah, and lots of feminist theory, queer theory coming in that. So I'm sure we'll get into all of it.
Cool. Kate, how about you? How'd you come to Shivers for the first time?
I was lucky enough. Well, it was a tough time. Family Video was going out of business. I had made friends with the dude that worked there, and one day he just told me to bring trash bags. I was like, oh, fucking okay. And he was like, dude, they're closing it. He was like, go take the horror section. And I was like, fuck yeah. And I went and I took all of it. Shivers.
And now it's Kate's Family Video.
It was literally, my heart's racing talking about this. It was one of the best days of my fucking life. I literally came home and my parents were like, oh no. And I really lucked out. And I that was one of the first films that I watched that I picked out of that bag. I was probably like 16 or 17 when I first watched it. That's like my favorite kind of horror. And this kind of walks that line a little bit for me, is like everybody just accepting that these sex slugs are like in fucking play. And everybody's like, yeah, this is bad. Like, I don't know. There's something about that suspension of belief that's very funny to me as well. It's kind of like unaware of itself. So yeah, I guess I just really like it. Family home video. Short answer. TLDR. Sorry.
Awesome. No. We always want to R. Emily, first time on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Tell us your origin story with Shivers.
Yeah, so I was probably like in my 20s, about 20 years ago when I was in grad school, and I studied modern art history, which included quite a bit about architecture. So when I saw the movie, the apartment building that played the Starliner Tower apartment seemed significant to me. And then, of course, it turns out it was designed by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, who's, an important Chicago-based architect. It was his firm anyway. It was kind of late in his career. So that's kind of debatable how much he was actually involved, but it's very much of his style. And then the philosophy of the Starliner, that it's a city within a city, which you never have to leave. And it has, the medical clinics and grocery stores and dry cleaner. That's based on Bauhaus architect Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, France. And that building became the model for large apartment buildings and public housing. It had a school, dry cleaners, medical clinics, grocery store, every amenity. So here's this gross, sleazy horror movie, but it has, these architectural theories kind of at play. I really love that duality to it. And then just being a horror movie fan, it's so crazy and shocking and unique. It's very memorable. And there's just nothing else like it. So I've been a big fan ever since.
Awesome. John, how about you?
My experience with Cronenberg did not start with Shivers, but started with his remake of The Fly and Scanners, and probably a handful of others that I just rented and watched and loved as a kid. Because I loved those films so much, I sought out as many other Cronenberg films as I could find. Shivers was one of the harder to find ones at my local video stores, but did find it eventually. And
that's because Kate had all the copies of it.
Yeah. And to be honest, like the first time I saw it, I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it like a lot of other Cronenberg films. And then flash forward to just a couple of years ago, I programmed a Cronenberg edition of Fetish Film Forum, a film festival here in Chicago. The films were going in reverse chronological order, sort of tracing back themes in Crimes of the Future all the way back to the beginning of his career with his first feature, Shivers, and just looking at queer, trans, and kink themes in the films. And upon revisiting a lot of Cronenberg films, my two favorites tied for the number one spot right now, I think have to be Shivers and Crash. But I mean, I adore nearly all the other films that he ever made as well. And I also wanted to give a quick shout out to the Leather Archives and Museum because I've been called in to help project a screening for IML this weekend. I have to beam in today, which is kind of a delight, from the reading room of the Leather Archives and Museum. This is not my collection that you see behind me. This is a massive assortment of pulps from like the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. They're so wonderful. And I also love this stained glass figure right here.
That's awesome, John. All you got to do, though, is just bring in your stuff, you can move right in. Jason, how about you? Where did you come to the Cronenberg Shivers for the first time?
I think it was one of the later ones that I'd seen as far as like 1980s. I probably saw like The Fly and Dead Ringers and Videodrome first. I was already a diehard Cronenberg fan by the time I'd seen it. So
I think it was The Dead Zone was the first time I knew Cronenberg's name, but then I realized, oh, that's the guy who did Scanners. And like a lot of people, like Videodrome and The Fly just shored things up. I was like, this guy's amazing. And what I really enjoyed the most about this most recent revisit is you go back and you think, okay, this movie's 50 years old, and this is a filmmaker at the very beginning of his career. He's done some experimental films. He's looking to do something that can be a little bit more commercial. And he comes up with this. And it's like, wow, like this is your idea of commercial. Okay, cool. Cinepex out of Canada was also looking for something that could be a little more viable. And they knew that the horror genre was a good way to get in. But that wasn't how Cronenberg was approaching it. He wasn't coming at it from a place of, if I do a horror film, then I can get into the mix and then I can make the movie I want to make. Like, this is the movie he wanted to make. And I think that's what's fascinating is he's just been so kind of honest and pure throughout his career. He makes these movies that tickle his brain and he hopes that they work for you as well. But that's not really what his concern is. He's not concerned with the populist. He's concerned with exposing ideas to people that they may not have heard before. The whole term of biological horror or body horror, like that has come to be almost synonymous with David Cronenberg. When we talk about body horror, and especially Cronenberg's relation to it, what do we mean by that?
My wife didn't know much about horror before she got with me, and that I'm happy to say that I've made a convert. So I found myself several years ago in the position of explaining to her what body horror was, because she thought it just meant gore. And I think a lot of people tend to think that, horror fans, it's one of those things that I think intuitively understand, but don't often break down until we're asked to define it. But we know that it's not just gore. I think that transformation is a big part of it. I think there tends to be a consciousness of, it starts with gore, which gives you the awareness of the body's fragility. But then usually there's some sort of remaking, remolding, repurposing that happens. So it's not just the gore is the awareness that, wow, my body is very vulnerable, but body horror takes a step further to say, I'm just made of building blocks that can be reassembled into something else.
First of all, my man, that was fucking beautiful, and I almost cried. I wish I were joking. That's so fucking good. For me, it's synonymous, yeah, but my brain actually goes Brian Usna first. For me, I think it's because I kind of grew up. He was a little bit more prominent when I was growing up, whereas Cronenberg was just like a scooch like ahead of him. For me, I don't know. I think Society. Oh God, it brings me so much joy, and I don't know why. Oh wait, yes I do. I had a pretty serious. Do you know what emetophobia is? Like legit, like all out panic of vomit. This was one of the only movies that I could watch that had vomit in it, and I don't know why. I think
it's all the blood, once you put some blood in vomit, it's fine.
Like it's never really like surprising or like particularly dark in one scene. It's always like Orange 40. Like I don't know. That's like I don't know. There's my input.
Well, one thing I'll throw in there as well is Cronenberg himself has said repeatedly that he doesn't know what the term body horror means, or even if his films embody it in the way that people ordinarily define body horror. I think what's interesting about Cronenberg's films is sometimes you could argue there is space for interpretation that the body horror in his films is truly horrific. I think it's often also rather neutral, and sometimes it's celebratory.
Right.
And I just think that's so, I don't know, such a fascinating thread through all of his work. And more often than not, I would say it's a neutral or celebratory territory.
Yeah, agreed. And I think by that you mean, we don't see the disease as the enemy or as something to be rejected. It is simply something that is doing its thing. It is its entity. It wants to survive as much as the humans do. And so the fact that it exists, this other thing exists, that's nature. That is the way the world works, is that things will constantly be vying for dominance, and one of them will win and one of them won't.
And also the parasite in Shivers, like, it is a separate entity, and it is sort of unleashing or unlocking or amplifying, to kind of reference one of the alternate titles of the film, what human beings already carry within themselves and what they've carried within themselves all along.
I thought it was interesting that Kate brought up Brian Usna, because Society is absolutely body horror, but it is a different, it's a more fantastical style of horror. Whereas Cronenberg, it's very much based in reality, in science, what's possible. We can't teleport now, or, maybe we can't create sex parasites now, but it seems very rooted in kind of real practices. The parasite is man-made. It's not something of nature. It's kind of interesting that these two filmmakers, they are kind of within this genre together, but even that they're very different.
As Cronenberg had a background in science and has a real interest in how things work and how they work together, like that symbiosis. I mean, he has a passion for racing cars, but it's about, how does the car work? How do you get the car to go faster? How do you get to go around the track and not slide off and die? I think he's very analytical in that regard. And I love how he just kind of presents things to people. This movie doesn't feel like it's trying to poke you emotionally. It is presenting things, it's presenting imagery, and you can do with it what you will.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that he was, I think, originally planning to go into to be a biologist. So he did have that background. The only other thing I was thinking is that recently I've been seeing body horror, the phrase, used the same way that giallo has been used for the last few years, or like literally every horror movie, someone's describing it as a body horror. Like, that's
happening with folk horror too, I think.
Oh,
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Well, when something's popular, of course, we want to we'll shove it into the popular pool. I think you nailed it, Cullen, like the idea of transformation and something interacting with another entity and that changing both of them, perhaps.
Right. Can I push back really quickly, though, on this idea that I hear a lot, that Cronenberg's films are supposedly cold and unemotional? Yeah, I've never thought that. I've always tried to push back on that, because I think the way you said it is great, that it doesn't tell you how to feel.
Right. It's without judgment, I think, is where I'm coming from. Like, from a scientist's point of view, I was reading the Chris Rodley's great book, Cronenberg on Cronenberg, which is a collection of interviews with David Cronenberg. And it talks about how the idea we have of scientists, right, that they are cold and analytical. And he's like, no, the best scientists are the crazy, passionate ones who are pursuing things as though their life depended on it. Like, they're very excited about it. And it's not cold and analytical. I don't think he's cold and analytical. I think he's excited to share these ideas.
Right.
And the scientists in this movie are not cold and analytical. I think it's very refreshing. They're funny and engaging. Well, funny when they're not killing a young woman in her apartment, but Linsky anyway is great to watch, and you don't think of him as being a typical scientist.
Yeah, I rewatched the movie yesterday with the commentary on with Chris Alexander and Cronenberg.
Right.
Cronenberg mentioned that people would often refer to his movies as humorless, which he was completely confounded by. I agree with that, but I can see how someone, if you're coming to one of them for the first time and you don't have any any like background or any context I can see is how someone might feel like that. But he claimed that every one of his movies is a comedy on some level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what stops people from seeing the comedy in his films is the initial shock value when you're approaching him for the first time. But revisiting Cronenberg films, they just get funnier and funnier.
Yeah, I think it's the world that the characters live in that is cold and indifferent, and the way it's presented is with as much warmth and humor as he can bring to it. But yeah, I've found him a deeply humanist because of the humor we're talking about. And because he really does care about his characters and plays the tape all the way through rather than just, like cannon fodder. I've always found him to be a deeply humanist filmmaker. Brandon Cronenberg, on the other hand, but that's another podcast.
Well, if we talk about like what the film is about, Emily, you mentioned we have the Starliner apartments. It's an apartment complex where everything is inclusive. As you said, they don't really need to leave the building, but that's because it's on an island. So they're thinking, okay, how can we make this as convenient for our residents as possible? We are introduced to the idea that scientists have come up with a parasite that they can introduce into the body, and it will take the place of a failing organ, like it will replace a kidney or replace a liver. But then we find out that, well, actually, this scientist was creating something entirely different. He was creating a parasite that would stimulate the sex drive and kind of take over people's minds and bodies and drive them to procreate. In addition to being called biological horror, Cronenberg's films have been called, at least his early films, as venereal horror because they spread through sexual contact or at least physical contact. So that's the basic setup for the film, is that we have this insulated area where the disease, such as it is spreading throughout, and there's nowhere to get away from it. Rather than the zombies being outside, the zombies are inside already, running down the halls naked.
The apartment itself becomes a body, with the people inside, the little disease parasites running around.
It's almost like the inverse of George A. Romero's Land of the Dead. They kind of build this totally self-contained ecosystem where all-inclusive living, protected from the outside world and the zombies in it.
Yeah, and if we talk about the Starliner itself, I mean, it is, if you talk about cold and removed, I mean, it is literally insulated. It's telling its residents not to interact with the outside world, that they can just stay inside and be a society unto themselves, which I think is an interesting social commentary.
I have questions about the on-site dentist. I think that's fucking weird. I want to know that guy's salary. I want to know what his hours are like. Does he live there? They don't show him. Is it a woman? I don't know. There's a whole story there. Where's the movie on that?
Are you excited about the dentist on site, or are you unnerved?
No, fucking freaked out. It makes me feel like I'm like rotting away. Better have a dentist on site to fix my shitty face as it falls apart in real time. I don't know.
Also, wouldn't there have to be two dentists? Because what about when the dentist needs dental work?
I know, he's like,
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, if it's all
he goes to
inclusive.
the hairdresser.
They just pool their money and send him to, in a cab to the mainland.
I couldn't help but think about The Shrouds, his newest movie, which also has a dental scene. So forget body horror, like dentist horror is
really just
through line
orthodontal.
in his career.
Back to Brian Usna, right? Didn't he do The Dentist?
Oh, yes.
He did.
Which is so underrated.
Nick Tudor is, in fact, using a water pick. So, clearly this dentist has established some good oral hygiene habits. Speaking of characters, we have our on-site doctor, Roger St. Clair, who's played by Paul Hampton.
St. Luke.
St. Luke, sorry. I don't know
Roger
who St.
St.
Clair is, but he's somebody else.
A very significant name. Don't get it wrong.
Roger St. Luke. There's something interesting about him being our hero because he's not necessarily heroic, nor is he very emotive. If we're going to talk about where some of those misconceptions about his characters and his films being a little cold and unemotional, I think it kind of starts there, and that he has centered the film around somebody who is not necessarily somebody we're rooting for, except for the fact that we are putting ourselves in that place and finding it maybe a little scary.
I have a hot take about Dr. St. Luke. First of all, The reason I was obstreperous about the name is because Saint Luke is the patron saint of physicians, artists, and butchers. Important, and also the author of the line in the gospel, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." My hot take is that Roger is not the main character. He's just the one that is that has the most screen time. I think Annabelle is the main character who has the least screen time.
First, I'd just love to hear more of your thoughts about that, Colin.
Well, her absence is what defines the film. I think she is the catalyst for everything that happens, and she's not absent because her body is living on. Like we were talking about, this idea of transformation, just sort of spreading what she left behind. That's why I brought up that this is my body, do this in remembrance, because it is causing this scenario, and her cells remain, sort of like makes me think of like Henrietta Lacks, who was whose biological material was used without her consent by researchers, and the cells, are still around being used for research. I think of her as like another woman, Annabelle, that is another woman sort of sacrificed on the altar of scientific progress against her will and without her consent. And she's also like the slut, right? She's the one who gets blamed for everything, for having been promiscuous, even though we find out that she was a sexually abused minor. If it weren't for her, it's almost like the whole scenario is kind of Annabelle's revenge. The return of the repressed in the form of like a disease vector.
You're making me think of Laura Palmer in Twin Peaks as well, and how even though she's been killed at the beginning of the story, she still feels so ever present in everyone's life and has had a role in everyone's story.
It really struck me in the scene when Dr. Linsky is telling Dr. St. Luke about the origin of Hobbs and Annabelle's relationship. They clearly don't approve of it, but just they're very crass and laughing. He calls her that chick, but she was a 12-year-old child that Hobbs took advantage of. So it kind of just makes it seem like, that there isn't really that strong of a contrast between that talk and then the events of what happens in the apartment building, people's behavior. It's like, this is just kind of how we are, and maybe the parasite lets it a little loose, but like that's already there within us. We don't need a parasite to behave poorly.
In terms of themes that Cronenberg visits time and again throughout his filmography, what are some things that pop up here that we seem to kind of see show up time and again?
What resonated with me as a young person watching this, as a, like barely out of puberty, was this kind of push and pull, attraction and repulsion from the idea of sex. Like it's something that we want to have in our lives, and it's something that is very good in Cronenberg's lens, but it also has this really dangerous, destructive power. I've never really been able to tell whether this film, or really any Cronenberg film, is entirely sex positive. Like at times it seems like it's blaming like venereal disease and like lots of other social problems on, promiscuity, and the kind of Hobbes like theory that is espoused that like man is an animal that thinks too much. He wants to turn the world into a beautiful mindless orgy, is very much criticized. But at the same time, there's just such a frank depiction of different kinds of love in this film. Like queer love is just presented as a fact of life, a little unusual for the time.
Right.
So it seems like his films are always pretty conflicted about that.
I think it goes back to what we were saying before about how he presents it just kind of as it is. He's not saying it's bad or good, just that humans are sexual beings. And one thing I like about this movie, and it's not in every movie, but is consistent throughout his career, it's in The Shrouds, just that there is an intersection between sex and sickness and old age and death. Hopefully we don't die young, and we will get sick and old. We're all going to die, and people stay sexual creatures throughout that. But you don't really see that in other movies. I imagine it's probably a little disturbing for people to think about. They want to think about young, beautiful people making love instead of grandma in the nursing home with her neighbor next door.
Emily, you're making me think. I might be paraphrasing it a little bit, but that line of dialogue, that stunning monologue beginning with the description of the dream that death is an act of sexuality.
All flesh is erotic, right?
My understanding is in an early screenplay that was the old man that was talking to her was explicitly identified as Freud.
His approach, again, like looking at things and sort of taking them apart, is that sex drive is like a biological imperative. Like what is it about that? Like what can go wrong with that? Like I find that just fascinating in all of his work, that is a major theme.
And we see it across a spectrum of ages, right? We have a young girl in the elevator to the elderly couple, the elderly Quebecois couple.
The laundry lady. In the commentary, just a little fun aside.
Yeah.
That was, I guess, just someone who like came in off the street when they were doing auditions. So She was like not an actor, had never done a movie or anything before.
So good.
Cronenberg
Very
was
John
really,
Waters.
Yeah.
Like me.
Yeah.
One of my favorite moments of the movie is when she emerges infected by the parasite saying, "Hungry for love."
We talked real quick about the girl in the elevator. I found out that this girl went on to do some voice work in the first English adaptation of Sailor Moon, which I was a fucking nut for. So I was like, oh my God, this has Sailor Moon ties. Did the voice of Zoisite, if you're familiar with Sailor Moon. What the fuck are the odds of that? And shit? I was like, I myself had shiver.
The Cronenberg account is that they did have a sign out on the street that said auditions upstairs. Like people literally could walk in off the street. I don't know if on the commentary, Jason, that they talk about how Paul Hampton came to get the role, because he's mostly a singer-songwriter. Like that is kind of his, he's from Oklahoma. So how he found his way up to Montreal to be the lead in a Cronenberg film is a story I'd love to hear.
He doesn't specifically get into how he got the part, but he does talk about how he took it very seriously and was like super method. And I guess that he sort of butted heads a bit with Joe Silver, who had the exact opposite approach, who was just like showing up and like doing the thing.
Yeah, he does seem to be taking himself rather seriously. But again, I wonder how much of that has to do with the fact that he's not necessarily an actor. He'd done some TV, and he wrote the song Sea of Heartbreak, which has been covered time and time and time again. So I think that's more what he's known for. But we also, you mentioned Joel Silver, who's absolutely wonderful and avuncular as Rollo.
Always eating.
Yeah. What is that name?
Yeah, he's great in Rabid too.
The 1-2 punch of Joe Silver is just a joy.
Leaning against the fridge with the sex is the invention of a clever venereal disease, like double fisting a Coke and a pickle. It's just like that is the one image from this movie that sticks in my head.
I feel bad. I don't like saying the guy who played the rental manager. Do we have his name?
Rod
That's right.
Mlodzik.
I also found out about him. I feel like he's like a Rick and Morty character. I'm like, how's he real? And like he's like in other films.
He was in the first two of Cronenberg's movies.
And I'm like, well, why is his acting like it just stops? And this dude went to become a sub deacon, a Catholic sub deacon. Just went on from Shivers to celibacy.
Wow.
Interesting. I would not have drawn that career path.
He was gay.
I don't know.
So
Kinda
I wonder
adds up.
if that was
Yeah, if there was
just
something
an
about
easy path to take.
Right.
But we also have Lynn Lowry, who's quite wonderful as Nurse Forsyth.
She came to Chicago a while along. This is probably a decade ago or more, for one of movie side events. I don't know if it was a sci-fi spectacular or something like that. But I'm not like an autograph person. But I could not resist bringing my Blu-ray of Radley Metzger's score to have her sign, and she was very excited when I pulled that out. She was super, super nice. It was really great to that was the first time I met her too. But yeah, she's amazing in this, and I think she sort of got this off of the back of The Crazies for Romero, but she talks there's an interview on the disc also where she talks how she'd been a little typecast at the time as like crazy ladies.
And she kind of saw horror movies as a stepping stone to doing something better, but never quite went in that direction. Just kept getting typecast in horror movies.
And Shivers, I would say she also has a little bit of main character energy. And I think my favorite moment with her, she doesn't even have any speaking lines, but it's the shots of her in the swimming pool looking so empowered and more menacing than she has anywhere else in the film.
Yeah, that image is big for me. Those two temptresses in the pool, sort of.
Although it's Janine and Barbara Steele,
Right.
Lynn Lowry, the Forsyth character, comes into the pool and administers the final kiss.
Right. Yeah, she shows up later. That's right. Yeah.
And they own that pool. They absolutely own that pool.
Yeah.
Well, one of my favorite scenes with Lynn Lowry, and this is, it could be seen as more prurient, but it's not, is where she just stands there in front of the doctor, completely disrobes, and then dresses again. Like she changes out of her nurse's uniform into her regular civilian clothes. And she's doing it in a way that says, here I am, I'm available. And at no point does Roger take her up on it. Like he's all caught up in the case. He's like this hard-boiled detective in that regard. But I just love how open she is. I think the women in this film are very open emotionally. And it's the men who seem very locked off, closed off, don't want to connect until they have these parasites introduced. And in the case of our character of Nick, he's actually fallen more in love with the parasites than his wife. Like he doesn't want to connect with her. And when he does, it's in an aggressive and violent way.
You get the impression that their marriage already was not happy before the movie begins. So
it's his fixation on the water pick, I'm telling you.
And that scene when he is laying in bed and I think the lights are out and he's talking to the lump on his stomach, it almost kind of has the vibe of a dude just talking to his penis, like giving it a name. It's a wild scene.
Yeah, encouraging it. With regard to the Barbara Steele character, Cullen, you mentioned earlier the idea that it is very queer friendly and that we're presented with a character who pretty obviously is a lesbian and there's no commentary around it. Or her friend doesn't seem to judge her for being a lesbian. She just isn't a lesbian as well. She gets the sense that, like, should she choose, there could be a relationship there. And it is she who ends up spreading the disease or the parasite from one to the other, which I think is a great scene. We talked about the bulges on the stomach, like that little inflation of the bladder on the neck in Barbara Steele. And then we see a mirroring one in Janine, which is, I just think it's such a great piece of cinema there.
And I love too that you can really see that this is something that Janine wants in that moment before she too becomes infected by the parasite. I was totally rooting for Janine and Betts through this entire movie. I adore that pairing. And kind of like what Emily said before, Janine's husband seems like he was always an asshole. So please, run off with Betts.
He's an insurance agent, so what can you say? Apologies to all the insurance agents who are watching right now.
I just always wondered if I always felt like that your main character actor, I always felt like he looked like Cronenberg. And I always thought that. I was like, I don't know. They have very similar faces, their hair. I didn't know if that was him kind of doing a little self-portraiture.
You mean the Nick Tudor character?
He's like, I could do better and maybe I'm an asshole. And who knows what he thinks of his fucking self, I don't know. I always thought that they looked similar though. And I wondered if that was probably not purposeful.
I could see that.
And that really comes back with the vengeance in the Shrouds with Vincent Cassel.
But talking about the behind the scenes, the person behind our physical practical effects is Joe Blasco, who had worked with Dick Smith, and they had to get him out of Hollywood. It was very much a Canadian production, except for they didn't have anybody in Canada who was doing those effects. So they got Joe Blasco on board, and he would also do Rabid as well. We also have Ivan Reitman as our producer, and I love that story as well. The fact that like Ivan Reitman's like, this could be a movie that people will respond to.
He's also the music supervisor, I believe.
Right.
This one picked out like the library music because there's no original score for this movie. I think the first couple or the first few movies of Cronenberg's didn't have any score made for it until he hooked up with Howard Shore later, and then they worked together for pretty much everything after that.
Yeah, I think The Brood was the first time he worked with Howard Shore, and boy, that's a relationship that I feel good about. Reitman does a really nice job here, and he'd kind of gotten his start in the exploitation elements of Canadian cinema. Like, he was working at a low budget. He and Cronenberg and a couple others created kind of a collective. All of them were kind of feeding off each other. We should probably get into this. Shivers was financed by the Canadian tax break. When the film came out, it realized all of their worst fears because Cinepex, they were excited to have their film financed, but the concern was that what would the taxpayers say if this is where their money was going?
I can't remember the publication. It was like Saturday Night, I think.
Yeah, Saturday Night was the magazine.
Yeah. So it was basically just this kind of inflammatory review. Someone posted, it's kind of like the NEA in Brooklyn situation, just like your taxpayer dollars are going to this. Meanwhile, by the time the article had come out, I think the movie had already made back the money and more.
Right.
So it's really like a non-issue. But I guess that writer kind of credits himself with giving Cronenberg like a cachet. I kind of made him successful because I
made him a bad
controversy.
Yeah.
Yeah, on the commentary, he talks about how that writer had seen his earlier work and was a big supporter. So he specifically took Shivers to this guy thinking he's going to get it. And instead the guy was like, if this is the kind of movie Canada is going to has to make in order to have a film industry, Canada should not have a film industry.
And I heard as well that a Cronenberg's landlord at the time read this article that we're talking about on the basis of like an indecency clause in the lease, evicted Cronenberg.
Yep.
And then he bought the house across the street. When he had
because the film, because this movie was made for about $185,000 Canadian, right, and grossed $5 million, in its worldwide theatrical. So quite an impressive return. But because of the notoriety, it actually stalled his career a little bit. It kept him from making Rabid for a couple of years, even though it ended up being with Cinepex and it ended up being that same tax break deal. The public had to mull it over for a while before they decided that they were okay with making money this way.
Aaron, have you ever done an episode of this just about Canadian tax break horror?
No, but we're gonna.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, we talked about The Brood. That was kind of where he was going to another level. But something I think that is interesting is, Roger Corman defines an exploitation film as the subject matter alone is what's going to sell the movie. It's not a star, it's not a director, it's the subject matter alone. And if we were going to boil down Shivers to kind of what its subject matter is, what would we call that? How are we selling this movie?
Killer sex parasites.
Yeah.
The screenplay was originally titled Orgy of the Blood Parasites.
Right.
Which is a very Corman-esque title.
Which is interesting because it's not necessarily a Corman flavored movie, right? I mean, it does have tinges of, what would we call Arthouse horror, in that it's done in an artful way and yet sloppy way. And it is, again, the subject matter of, slimy sex parasites, that's not going to end up in anybody's high-end cinema. But it did play very well. I think it's really important as a stepping stone, but also, as I said at the beginning, it's reflecting Cronenberg and his interests. It's not just him trying to cash in on something. That's the Roger Corman approach, right? Is what will the kids go see? Whereas Cronenberg was, what's the story I want to tell? And then Rabid is kind of a natural evolution. It's okay, we've told it in a very insular way. Shivers ends with them, all the cars driving off the island to spread the disease. And then we have, Rabid, where the entire city is being infected by a sex parasite.
I'm always interested in first films, debut films, because some filmmakers play it safe because they want to make another movie, and some just like take a big swing because they're like, this may be my only chance to make a movie, so they just put everything they can in there. I feel like this is definitely the like auteurist version of the big swing. And I also just love when you can see pretty much all of the author's obsessions right from the very beginning.
Yeah.
You know, like this is like as good a movie as any. If somebody asks you like, what does Cronenberg do? You know, like you can't go wrong with showing them this one. You know what I mean? It's a maybe even a little bit trial by fire.
You could be mean and like tell them start with Fast Company.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, he'd made, Stereo and Crimes of the Future, but he didn't know, what a key grip was. He didn't know what people did. So it's
Right.
pretty bold of him to be like, hey, Cinepix, I'll sell you the script, but I have to direct. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to direct. If you want the script, I have to direct. And then, they just kind of surrounded him with people who did know what they were
Right.
doing. And then, when he first saw the rushes, he was kind of like, oh, maybe I don't know what I'm doing. But then he started to get better and fell into it. So it's like you're kind of watching him learn how to make a movie in real time.
Kind of going along with that, because he was somebody who had just done things on his own, and suddenly he had a crew to work with. The idea that he was fighting to direct this film, I mean, apparently when he went out to meet with Roger Corman, Jonathan Demme told him that he'd read his script, and somebody from Cinepix had actually come down to Corman and was shopping it around and trying to get somebody from Corman's stable to direct it instead of Cronenberg. But I think there's something about this film that is so very 1975, the plush cover on the toilet seats. And there's something about that even though it immediately dates the film, for audiences watching it in that time, it feels so now. It feels so current. It isn't set in some far off castle somewhere. It is now. It is immediate. It is modern. And I think that really helped it resonate with audiences as well. Any thoughts on that?
Kind of the low budget, they had to use people's actual apartments. They didn't have money to dress it up. So that really worked to the benefits of the film.
Two things. First, just fun side fact is the Corman Demme thing is how Barbara Steele ended up getting involved because she was working on Caged Heat, I think.
Right. Yeah.
At the
Yeah.
time. Yeah. The other thing I was going to say is in the commentary track again, Cronenberg talks about how important it was for him to have the movie based in like the real world.
Yeah.
So using people's actual apartments and all this stuff that's in their apartments, really helped sell that idea. Like this isn't some weird, space sci-fi monster movie. Like this is happening like next door.
Does anybody make roasts anymore?
Roasts? Yeah, I don't know.
She was like super like, can't let this roast go, man. And like I'm like, let the
It's
roast
only
go.
two of them. And it's like,
Yeah, exactly. Like,
It's a giant.
the dentist and the roast occupy a lot of real estate in my mind.
Yeah, you expect there to be a souffle that's in danger of falling
Yeah,
at
that's
some
like,
point in
a
the movie.
fucking well done something. Long.
I drowned in a
know.
fondue pot.
Let's circle back around for final thoughts on Cronenberg, on Shivers, anything that comes to mind. Jason, let's start things off with you.
Men will literally surrender to a sex parasite rather than go to therapy. I thought while I was watching this, but yeah, I don't know. I love Cronenberg so much. I think he's one of the best to ever do it. The level of his work is just consistently amazing, all the way up through the Shrouds, which I really like. But I did rewatch Crimes of the Future, the more recent one, just recently on the big screen again, and as mentioned earlier, it was like way funnier. Like it's probably the third or fourth time I've seen it, and it really does get funnier every time. And it was especially fun to watch it. Like my friend Dee Dee programmed it for the Draft House here in Chicago as a Weird Wednesday, and it was well attended. So it was cool to watch that with like a crowd, and people are actually like laughing at jokes and stuff, and not just being like goofy weirdos, but they're really into it.
Nice. John.
Cronenberg, as a director, and you can really see this in Shivers as much as any of his other films, is far less interested in what human beings think we are or what human beings want to be, and far more interested in what we really are. And I think the body horror in his films is an exercise in digging into that reality and revealing its core. And kind of like what Cullen was saying before, I love the way that he did this so fully and so successfully in his first widely released feature. It's really stunning. And this was just such a super fun conversation. Thank you all so much for chatting about this film. It was a total blast.
Cullen?
On the Crimes of the Future being funny thing, I love, my biggest laugh in that is when Kristen Stewart walks up to Viggo and says, surgery is the new sex. And he goes, did we need a new sex? I love that. Like, I felt seen by that line. But yeah, read more of my thoughts on this film in my book coming out this year sometime from McFarlane Publishing. Had to get that back in there. But it is interesting because I think you can see from gender segregated space of hygiene and therapy, which was what municipal swimming pools were originally for, all the way through sort of like a place for people to observe each other in near nudity in a public place, like pretty much the only place you can do that socially acceptably in North America anyway. And then to a place that sort of separates the haves from the have-nots and isolates the wealthy people and the people with means in this sort of greenhouse, hothouse pressure cooker thing. There's pretty much all of the interpretive shades of the swimming pool are in this movie. And it was really a great one that started my analysis. And as a very final thought, pivoting completely, Ivan Reitman may be responsible for the two greatest apartment building horror films ever, Shivers and Ghostbusters.
Nicely done. Kate?
I don't think I really emphasized, this is probably, he said in his top 3 Cronenberg movies, this is in my top 3 movies. I watched it last night after throwing this 4-year-old's birthday party, and it was like I actually got to hang out with me, and that was so fucking cool. I felt like, oh yeah, that's who I am, this sick fuck, and it was nice to be like, there she is, the end.
Emily?
Well, I'm just so glad that Cronenberg really advocated for himself to take charge and do this movie. Yeah, maybe it's low budget, maybe not everything quite works, but it's just so innovative. Yeah, and maybe it looks dated, but there's just so many things about it that are just not done today. Themes that we didn't even talk about, like pandemics or the AIDS being a thing. There's just so many levels to this movie. Yeah, maybe on the surface it's just kind of a cheap exploitation horror movie, but there's so much going on. So glad it started Cronenberg's career and gave us all these great movies.
Agreed. And yeah, think about the pandemic. I mean, that was actually allowed me to look at this movie in a different way, because I think we get frustrated by viewers when a disease affects people differently, like when there isn't a consistent response, and how, here we have, some people become extremely amorous and some people become violent. And after going through the pandemic where the virus did affect people differently, I'm like, this actually feels more authentic than what would be a traditional horror approach to things. Thank you all so much. What a great conversation. And looking forward to having you all on again very soon. And until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.